Hello, welcome to our next lecture on the culture wars and the resurgence of conservatism and the Republican Party in U.S. politics. So we've seen some pretty big changes taking place in the U.S. We've seen and discussed the emergence of massive social movements for African American civil rights, for women's rights, for gay rights. And we've seen push for change on a number of fronts, even ones we weren't able to cover in great depth, like the environmental movement, anti-nuclear movement, free speech movement. Some of you argued that collectively these added up to a sort of revolution in American society. And that's a fair argument to make. Big changes took place in the decade of World War II. And we've also seen some pretty significant legislative, political steps taken. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which barred discrimination based on both race and sex. Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Great Society programs to try to alleviate poverty. Medicare, Medicaid. The Immigration Act of 1965, which after more than 4 decades reopened America's doors to immigrants. So major changes have taken place. American society grew more inclusive and open. Whether that's a good or bad thing, that's a subject of political debate, and today we're going to talk to those who believe that change was for the worst. And we've seen the federal government in Washington, D.C. grow more active and interventionist, trying to improve education, trying to curtail poverty, trying to address racial discrimination and segregation and voter suppression. So those two developments, a more open, permissive, inclusive society on the one hand, and a more active and bigger federal government, these would be the two chief developments that conservatives in the what I call the culture wars and the conservative resurgence, it's what they would be responding to. Many of them uneasy with these changes, with the new things that the government was taking on, with the way families were changing, with the way gender roles were changing. With the federal protections for abortion rights and privacy. These things alienated a number of Americans, and they would make up the base for this conservative resurgence, and they would help push political change and try to reverse some of those changes that emerged during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Now, for some of those changes, the genie's out of the bottle and can't be put back in. But that wouldn't stop conservatives from trying. So today we're going to focus on this backlash or counter movement, if you will, an effort to push back against the changes unleashed after World War II and hark back to what these conservatives would refer to as traditional values, the kinds that you see represented in the 50s of the nuclear family, or at least a particular image of it. So that's what we're going to focus on today. the social and political response to the changes that took place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that we've been focusing on. Looming large over all of this is also the Vietnam War, which split Americans deeply, as we've seen. But the lessons that people took from it, from that Vietnam debacle, were very different depending on one's own politics. The political tide would shift at the federal level thanks to the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. Nixon is a character who's recurred in our history so far. As we've seen, he was a staunch anti-communist congressman from California during the Red Scare. He was vice president to President Dwight Eisenhower, who served 2 terms in the 1950s. He was John F. Kennedy's opponent in 1960, one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Nixon lost that one, however. But he would reemerge in 1968, and he would be the Republican nominee for president. And he ran in part of his platform was promising an end to the Vietnam War, which he would eventually deliver on. But as we've seen, as we saw last time, but he would end it, he actually expanded the war, which was quite controversial and was responded to with massive protests. But Nixon would be part of this backlash, this conservative resurgence in response to, in opposition to, changes that were taking hold, particularly in the 1960s. And as an example of this, in November of 1969, and you see a still image pictured there, Nixon gave a famous speech. It's become known as the silent majority speech. And in it, he appeals to this group, the silent majority, whom he sets apart from those noisy people making a ruckus in the streets. Protesters, demonstrators, marchers, college students, hippies. As he sets up this scenario, he sees that most Americans are silent, they're the majority, and he believes they're uneasy with the kind of clashes they're seeing around civil rights, around anti-war protests, and other of the struggles to expand Americans' rights. There's a quote there on the screen from Nixon's silent majority speech. He says, "And so tonight to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat." Here in this case, he's talking about the Vietnam War. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that. Let me for a moment interpret this speech for you. And this interpretation is based not just on the words of the speech, but also recollections of Nixon's speechwriters and advisors, the behind-the-scenes words of Nixon himself. The great silent majority, that term, means white people. The strategy that Nixon was employing in 68 and he'd employ again in 72 was known as the strategy. That's what his own advisors called it. And the goal was to try to draw Southern Democrats, who were more conservative, draw Southern Democrats into the Republican Party. And those Southern Democrats had been growing alienated from the Democratic Party, largely because of Democrats' accommodations on civil rights, like the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. And so this is what's become known as dog whistle politics, where there's this subtle racial message embedded in the words. It's not explicit, but the great silent majority, he's trying to reach white Americans growing uneasy with the present and feeling nostalgic for a past that may never have existed. Let me move on and look at the other part of the statement that I quote here. Let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. So there he's trying to appeal to America's sense of superiority. Only Americans can do that. American sense of invincibility. So what he's doing here, and this is clear just from the text, he's saying that if the war in Vietnam is unsuccessful, blame the protesters. Blame those stereotypical hippies and those college students who are causing so much trouble. They're the ones sapping Americans' will, is his message. So, in this speech, he's dividing Americans into different camps, appealing to those more socially conservative and nostalgic white Americans, putting them in one box and saying, this message is for you, and separating out those people who were agitating for social and political change, including African Americans. He's setting apart. Many people would hear Nixon's message, and even when Nixon would no longer be around to reach people with this message or to try to respond to the desires, demands, grievances of this silent majority, others would carry the baton for him. And we see this backlash begin bubbling up, sometimes in violent ways. And when I say backlash, in this specific case, backlash against the anti-war movement, which, as we've seen, we saw in our last lecture and discussion, that there's a separation between those who oppose the war and sat in their living rooms, watched the news on TV, and were uneasy about it, or maybe they had a loved one who was serving and felt a moral opposition to the war. Many of those people didn't take banners and march through the streets or shut down college campuses. Many of them just had their personal gripes, or they spoke at the ballot box when they voted for their candidates of choice. And then there were, though, of course, those who were deeply opposed to the war and were moved to protest against it. And of course, they received the most attention. They were the most visible because where they went, there were news cameras, there was news coverage, there were trials and police records. And so they were quite visible, and intentionally so. And so they received the lion's share of attention, and also they would receive the ire of those conservatives who felt as if those demonstrators were demeaning America. And we see that at work in so-called Bloody Friday. In May 1970, there was an anti-war protest in New York City in the financial district. And while it's taking place, a group of construction workers in hard hats. If you look closely at the picture, you can see hard hats. These construction workers march from their workplace, descend on those protesters, and begin beating them. Sometimes this is also referred to as the hard hat riots. And as you see, they're carrying American flags. They believe, these counter-protesters, these construction workers who attack the anti-war protesters, they believe that those protesters are undercutting America's interest, they're anti-patriotic, and so they assault them. So this shows how deep the divisions were. And of course, not just related to the Vietnam War, though, of course, conflict was intense around that particular conflict. Now, of course, the US and Vietnam would settle a treaty in 1973, and in 1975, North Vietnam takes South Vietnam. And this major commitment over many decades turned out to be unsuccessful. The effort to contain communism, to prevent it from overtaking Vietnam, failed. And so there was a significant amount of bitterness, hard feelings about the outcome of the Vietnam War. And a lot of finger pointing as well. Who's to blame? Was it a war that the US never should have been involved with? Or was it a war with which the US lost its will because of those protesters? They prevented America from unleashing its full power and winning what should have been an easy victory. Different interpretations for the same events. But regardless, America was licking its wounds over a failed war, and a war that caused significant tensions at home, divided friends, neighbors, families, divided Americans deeply. One of the reasons why Nixon wanted to end the Vietnam War was because he had bigger fish to fry. He wanted to reopen negotiations with communist nations, try to ease tensions, and get away from that belligerent Cold War posture that had characterized so much of the Cold War, particularly through the Cuban Missile Crisis and, of course, the Vietnam War. And so, as president, you see on the screen, there's Richard Nixon and his wife Pat on the Great Wall of China. As we've seen, the communist regime took power in China in 1949. And in the 1970s, Nixon sought to reopen relations with China, ease tensions, and establish what was known as a strategic partnership. They're not at the point where they are allies or trading partners yet. But this opens the door to that potentiality. And also, in the 70s, Nixon reaches out to the hated Soviet Union and engages in a policy known as détente, which means the easing of tensions with the Soviet Union. And so the two nations, the US and Soviet Union, would work out arms reduction agreements, reducing weapons testing, And just the fact that they were talking, negotiating itself was a sign of at least the possibility of a new relationship. Now, of course, before Nixon could see all of these through to all of these measures through to their conclusion, he would be forced to resign. Nixon would run for re-election in 1972, and what turned out to be an easy victory for him in the electoral count would also be his undoing. Advisors of his broke into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., and they were caught in the act. They were trying to plant bugs, listening devices, at Democratic National Headquarters. They were caught, arrested, and then question after question arises. What did the president know? Was he involved? Anyone close to the president involved? And so what ensues is an effort that Nixon was heavily involved in, an effort to try to cover up the Watergate break-in, which involved possible plans to intimidate witnesses. There was even, they never acted on it, but there was even a proposal to kidnap people and blow up buildings. And Nixon fired attorney generals and others who were in charge of investigating the charges against people in Nixon's administration. He denied a role in the cover-up, but eventually evidence comes to light that does implicate him. Before impeachment proceedings could begin, impeachment proceedings, those are proceedings that begin in the House of Representatives that could possibly lead to the removal of a president. But before those proceedings begin, Richard Nixon resigns, the only president ever to resign from office. And his vice president, Gerald Ford, takes over. So, if we thought after the Vietnam War Americans were skeptical of their government then and mistrustful of their government then, now they hear and read in the news about their president involved in cover-ups of crimes and resigning. Gerald Ford, his successor, would pardon Nixon, so there would be no charges, no prison time or fines or anything like that for Nixon. But this further undermines Americans' faith in their government, and for some, with the American project in general. And there was more bad news. That wave of economic growth from the 1950s through the 1960s would become much less steady, much less consistent during the 1970s. And you begin to see more images like the one here, shuttered factories, broken down factories. Because, for a number of reasons, a quarter century of rapid economic growth, the economy begins to stagnate and slow down. incomes, productivity, and output all drop sharply. Recessions, that's the negative growth in the GDP, recessions became more severe and more frequent in the 70s, while unemployment rose. The decade after 1973 brought the post-war boom to an unsettling end. What explains this new era of uncertainty and difficult times and rising inequality? Well, first, this is a smaller contributor, but it is a factor. First, the spending for the Vietnam War, those spiraling costs had set off waves of inflation, rising prices, which made products manufactured, purchased here in the US more expensive, especially when compared to those of other countries. This meant then that foreign goods were less expensive, more were imported, leading the US to import more than it was exporting by 1971. One import in particular that was becoming incredibly more expensive was oil. In October of 1973, in the midst of war between Israel and several of its Arab neighbors, oil producers, who were part of a group called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, oil producers declared an embargo on oil shipments to the United States and Western Europe. This was in retaliation for America's support for Israel during this war. OPEC manipulated the resulting shortage to raise prices. The price of a barrel of oil went from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. Now that seems so tiny for us, where these days a barrel of oil costs close to $100. But of course that's with inflation over the last several decades. But when a barrel of oil jumps from $3 to $12, it quadruples in cost. And those costs are going to be shared throughout the economy for people who heat their homes, fill their tank. The following year, the disruption of energy supplies and the dramatic rise in the price of oil led to federally mandated gasoline rationing. And that's what you see on the screen there, those images. Shortages of gas. The government would have to declare rationing. Only this group of people can purchase gas on this day of the week. This group can purchase on a different day to try to conserve the dwindling supply and the increasingly expensive supply of fuel. And Americans, in response, bought fewer gas-guzzling cars, and those were the bread and butter of American car manufacturers. And so, the country's number one industry, auto manufacturing, saw its factory output drop significantly. Car production was America's number one industry. You may remember I mentioned in an earlier lecture that in the 1950s and 60s, the US produced 80% of all the cars in the world. But and many of them were being purchased by Americans because cars were in such great demand, especially with the rise of the suburbs. But with gas that much more expensive, the car company's specialty, big muscle cars, gas guzzlers, they're not selling. And so foreign competition undercuts America's dominance in the auto industry. And not only was the price of oil and petroleum products increased dramatically, so the cost of other goods. Inflation levels soared, reducing the value of people's paychecks and pensions. So if you find 1970 on the chart there, through the 60s, through much of the 60s, you see inflation. This is the U.S. inflation rate, which tracks the rise and fall of prices. In the 1960s, through much of them, prices remain relatively flat. There are no dramatic dips or highs. You see it start to creep up in the late 60s. That's in part because of spending for the Vietnam War. But then in the early 70s, inflation drops and then shoots up again in a dramatic way. And you see that on the chart. That's because of this OPEC embargo and the rising price of oil. Unemployment remained high, rarely below 7% from 1973 to 1983. For 2 full decades, in the early 70s into the early 90s, real wages stagnated for most Americans. And for young men, their wages actually dropped by 25%. American businesses faced a profit squeeze, and so they moved around. Some went from, say, the Northeast to the South to find an environment less favorable to labor unions and worker protections and with lower wages and lower costs. Some moved overseas as they try to cut what they pay workers, reduce their taxes, and evade government regulations. Many moved into the South and Southwest, where worker protections were fewer and laws more business friendly. It was also during this time that companies were opting to take their factories overseas. This is a practice called outsourcing. This is the share of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. As you see, there's been a pretty consistent downward trend with some slight upticks now and then since the mid-1960s. The percentage of Americans working in manufacturing is dropping. Now, this isn't to say that a manufacturing job is inherently better than working in fast food or teaching or any other job. But the point here is that these factory jobs were good-paying jobs, often came with perks, benefits like health insurance, paid vacations, union protection, some measure of security. In other words, even though these were working class jobs, they bought a middle class lifestyle and they were being lost. As you see from this graph, this trend has in large part continued. You see it ends in 2009, and there's been a bit of recovery. I'm of course not back to pre-1960 levels, but manufacturing jobs did come back for a moment with the early months and years of the recovery after the 2008-2009 crash. But that turned out to be a blip. And so this manufacturing economy that required dozens of workers to run a plant is being replaced by a technology and service-driven economy. And the adjustment has not been a smooth process. So, you have several things combining here in the late 60s and early 70s that make for a very volatile mix. You have a lot of resentment and bad feelings surrounding protests and civil rights, and of course the violent consequences of some of those clashes. The anti-war movement, Americans losing faith in their government, and now the economy that seemed as if it would boom forever is starting to put on the brakes. So we see a rising anxiety, rising uncertainty, economically, socially, politically. And so the conservative movement would try to fill this void of trust, try to address people's anxiety. And they did that in part by appealing to a sense of nostalgia, tradition. The changes, they say, of the last several years are responsible for the current state of anxiety. We just go back to the way things were in the 50s in particular. That's kind of the image that they peddle. Then we can restore America to its previous greatness when heroically America had beat back fascism and Japanese imperialism and emerged from the war stronger. The Depression long over. The United States had proved to the world then that it had a superior system to the Cold War. We could only get back to that. Those traditions, those earlier customs that they argue were at the heart of America's greatness. And so just to transition here, we've discussed over the last couple of classes the changes that took place during the 60s and 70s, mass suburbanization and the consequent hollowing out of American cities, the realization in legislative terms of major civil rights acts, a more active and aggressive government, which intervenes more in people's lives through such things as Medicare and Medicaid, the development of a freer and more inclusive society, where not only African Americans but also women and LGBT Americans fought for a seat at the table, a sexual revolution which saw premarital sex become the norm. We see a decrease in birth rates, the end of the baby boom, and an increase in the number of divorces. A widespread anti-war movement questions the wisdom of the American government and challenges established authorities. And now we begin to see the end of the post-World War II economic boom. And in its place come greater economic insecurity and anxiety. Change is difficult and painful, and not all change has positive results. In response to these changes, a powerful conservative movement rises. Its message is that America was heading in the wrong direction. In light of these vocal and very visible movements for change that we've discussed, and the consequences of those movements, adherence to tradition felt threatened. Conservatives were alarmed. Even during the 1950s, when family values seemed to be at their peak, some conservatives were upset with even Dwight Eisenhower, who did not challenge the remaining New Deal legislation left over from Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. What would become far more influential than that was the so-called New Conservatism that we're focusing on today. New conservatives understood freedom as first and foremost a moral condition. Freedom was something all people strive for or should strive for, and it was a positive good. Freedom required a decision by independent men and women to lead virtuous lives, they argued. But where they mainly focused this freedom message was in economic terms. These new conservatives wanted government expelled from the economy as much as possible, wanted the free market to rule. But at the same time that they preached freedom in economic terms, like reduce regulation, reduce taxes, at the same time they were doing that, they had no qualms with using the government to regulate personal behavior, to restore Christian morality they saw as growing weaker in American society. And these were major players. Evangelical Christians were major players in the resurgence of the Republican Party and conservatism in general. Conservatives set themselves apart from, of course, the Soviet Union, which they saw as godless, communistic, aggressive. But they also set themselves apart from liberals and Democrats. And also these symbolic foes who were much in evidence in the 1960s. Anti-war protesters were the enemies. Countercultural rebels were the enemies. So to these new conservatives, the free market underpinned personal freedom. The government must be strictly limited. And international communism was the gravest threat to liberty and must be destroyed. So, as we'll see, after Nixon eases tensions with communist countries, the new conservatives would step in and re-litigate, re-up the rhetoric and the pushback against communism. These beliefs would find a foothold in the Republican Party, which was in the process of significant change. Back in 1964, that was the year that Lyndon Johnson won a major re-election. Now, actually, it wasn't a re-election because he replaced the assassinated Kennedy. But in 1964, Lyndon Johnson wiped the floor with his opponent, Republican Barry Goldwater, who in many ways embodied this new conservatism Goldwater did. Now, though Goldwater was slaughtered in the general election by Johnson, Goldwater's support from suburbanites and in the growing Southwest and West, as well as the previously solidly Democratic South, all of this predicted that a new conservative Republican coalition would emerge, and emerge it would. And women were prominent in the new conservatism. One is pictured on your screen now. That is Phyllis Schlafly. You see the spelling on the screen. Some, like Phyllis Schlafly, rallied together in opposition to a proposal called the Equal Rights Amendment, shortened to ERA in that sign on the screen. The Equal Rights Amendment was an amendment that could have been added to the Constitution. That would be the first acknowledgement of gender and protect people based on sex, their gender. It made it through Congress, but as it was making its way through the states have to approve a constitutional amendment before it's ratified. As it's making its way to the states, Phyllis Schlafly forms the Eagle Forum in 1975 and lobbies against this Equal Rights Amendment. She says that the ERA will cause women to be drafted, lead to same-sex public bathrooms, will undermine what is in her mind women's proper traditional role as wives and mothers. In fact, Phyllis Schlafly has been vocal in even more recent debates about the pay disparity between men and women. And Schlafly says that that's actually good. She wants men to be paid more than women because that would discourage women from working and put them back in the home. So as you see, she's clearly pushing back against women's liberation, feminism, the changing family dynamics that were emerging in the 1960s and 70s. And of course, opposition to abortion as well, which, as we saw, the case Roe v. Wade protected a woman's right to an abortion within the first trimester. And so these changing family dynamics, what were perceived as affronts to Christian morality, would galvanize Schlafly and others to push back. Another example of a vocal, active woman in these culture wars was Anita Bryant. She was a popular singer who founded a group called Save Our Children, or Protect America's Children. And if you look at the sign behind her, what is she trying to save America's children from? As the sign indicates, from homosexuality. She sees homosexuality as an affront to Christian morality, as a perversion, which, as we saw, was actually the mainstream perspective until very recently. For example, Bryant led a push to try to criminalize gay teachers, prevent teachers from LGBT people from teaching. In Florida, there was a law being debated in Florida preventing gay people from teaching in classrooms. So clearly she was unnerved by the more open society that was beginning to emerge, and she was trying to push back against gay rights in this case. Clearly, with Schlafly and Bryant, their Christian faith was central to their politics. And the so-called religious right, that has been kind of term to describe these individuals, the religious right would be prominent in the new conservatism that was growing in strength over the course of the 70s and into the 80s. And the economic problems we discussed heightened the appeal of lower taxes, which was a favorite proposal of Republicans, reduced government regulation, and cuts in social spending. They could point the finger, whether it was accurate or not, at liberal reforms of the 1960s, the Great Society, and say these are causing our current troubles, and promise a solution of their own. And fears about a decline in American power abroad, especially after the Vietnam War, led to calls for a renewal of the Cold War. That's a way that America can re-enter the world stage with a show of strength and exhibit its superiority, exceptionalism to the world. Nixon had open talks with China, as we saw, and cooled relations with the Soviet Union. Civil rights and sexual revolutions produced resentments that undermined the democratic coalition, and so the time was ripe for a counter-movement. Rising urban crime rates reinforced demands for law and order and attacks on lenient courtrooms. And these issues brought new converts to the conservative cause. And the popular base of conservatism consisted of religious fundamentalists, evangelical Christians, especially Baptists, had become more and more alienated from a culture that seemed to them to trivialize religion and promote what to them seemed like immorality, divorce, premarital sex. In 1979, Jerry Falwell, pictured there, a Virginia minister, created a self-styled moral majority, a group that was devoted to waging war against sin and electing what he called, quote, pro-life, pro-family, pro-America candidates to office. So in other words, this was religion and politics. Religious conservatives battled over women's rights and gay rights, but no issue sparked their fight more than abortion did. They insisted and continue to insist that life begins at conception and abortion is nothing less than murder. And so they will back candidates who will put on the Supreme Court anti-abortion justices. They will support people who will try to curtail Planned Parenthood or other abortion providers. They will support candidates who send a message that they refer to as pro-life, pro-family, pro-America. Of course, nobody is running a pro-death, anti-family, anti-America platform. So it's their particular vision of life, which they say begins at conception, particular vision of a family, which is a nuclear, man-centered family. One man, one woman, and a bunch of kids. And an America that resembles kind of the Leave It to Beaver suburban ideal in their minds. But conservatives, of course, did not confine themselves to just moral issues. There were economic problems, there were global issues, foreign affairs, war and peace, all of these issues they took positions on. They sought to limit regulations, limit taxes. To these conservatives, tax reductions served the dual purpose of enhancing business profits and reducing resources available to government so that they could then cut back on the activities of government, thus making new social programs financially impossible. The movement would find its standard bearer in an unlikely figure. Ronald Reagan. Reagan himself used to be a Democrat during the 30s and 40s. He was a supporter of President Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. But he became disillusioned with liberalism over time. We encountered Reagan once before when we discussed the Red Scare. Reagan was an actor, and he was president of the Actors Guild, the actors union, who was concerned with possible communist infiltration of labor unions and Hollywood, and so he was a friendly witness to HUAC during its hearings. But you also see he also campaigned against what he called socialized medicine. In this case, he's campaigning against Medicare, saying that it's the opening wedge of socialism. During the 60s, Reagan vocally opposed federal civil rights legislation. He actively campaigned against the war on poverty by Lyndon Johnson, including, as we see, ads against Medicare, which he called socialized medicine. In 1966, Reagan ran for governor of California. And in that campaign, he painted himself as the opponent of those unwashed protesters and hippies that people saw on their TV screens making trouble in the streets and on college campuses. Two quotes from his campaign for governor stand out in this regard. He promised, quote, to send the welfare bums back to work, end quote. And he promised, quote, to clean up the mess at Berkeley. Of course, Berkeley is a very good and famous university in California where there were a lot of protests in opposition to the war, in favor of student rights and free speech. And so he said he's going to clean up that mess, restore law and order. He also says, as I noted, he's going to send the welfare bums back to work, setting up this image of America into different categories. There are those who work hard and earn a living in an honest way, and those who leech off of the government, those so-called welfare bums. And he says he's going to cut back on government programs, and those welfare bums, so-called, will have no choice but to go back to work. So he campaigned against so-called big government, and he called for a return to traditional values. And he became a charismatic and rising star in the Republican Party. And he would serve as California governor until 1975. He ran for the Republican nation for president in 1976, but lost to the nominee Gerald Ford, who, as we saw, became president with Nixon's resignation. Ford, however, in 1976 would lose to Democrat Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter had been governor of the state of Georgia. In 1980, Reagan would successfully win the Republican nomination for president, and he faced that year an opponent in Jimmy Carter who was on the ropes. Why was that? The country would be in even greater economic turmoil in 1979-80. As we discussed, the country's economy was growing and shrinking in fits and starts throughout the decade. That period of seemingly endless boom had come to an end. But in 1979, there was a second oil shock, another oil embargo, which sent prices skyrocketing once again. And in the upper left-hand side of the screen, you can see the inflation rate even surpass the rate from the mid-1970s that we saw a moment ago. So prices are rising, and an unusual development, unemployment was also rising. Usually in times of economic crisis, of depression, prices go down. But something unusual happening here, so-called stagflation. Stag for stagnant economy, meaning more and more people out of work, and inflation for inflation. Rising prices and rising unemployment. Two things that usually did not go hand in hand, happening at the same time. A new kind of economic suffering for Americans. Not only did they have lower wages and people were out of work, but things were costing more. So they were struggling from all angles. Carter would also face an international crisis in 1979-80. In 79, the Soviet Union invades the country of Afghanistan. And this heightened Cold War tensions between the US and Soviet Union once again. For example, the United States in 1980 would boycott the Olympics in Moscow and the Soviet Union in protest of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Now, unfortunately for the Soviets, Afghanistan would turn into a debacle, possibly even worse than Vietnam. The Soviet Union was less equipped to deal with that kind of disaster. Their invasion of Afghanistan dragged on and dragged on. They met fierce resistance from the people of Afghanistan, and those people of Afghanistan would receive weapons and aid from the United States. And eventually, the Soviet Union would have to leave Afghanistan with their tails between their legs. But not before this heightened Cold War tensions, after they had been easing for some time. Furthermore, the country of Iran was undergoing a revolution in 1979, and American diplomats got caught up in this revolution. Now, by the way, the regime that is being resisted and overthrown here is the one that had been installed by the US government back in the 1950s. And we talked about that when we talked about the Cold War. From America's point of view, the regime change, yes, raised a lot of questions, a lot of troubling questions and possibilities. But in the short term, the immediate concern was that 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days after a group of Iranian students supporting the revolution took over the US Embassy in Tehran. Those of you who've seen the movie Argo dramatizes part of this story, the Iranian Revolution, the taking of hostages. President Jimmy Carter ordered a rescue attempt of those hostages, but it was a dismal failure. The helicopter crashed, and the hostages remained there for, as I said, 444 days. By 1980, with the economy struggling and embarrassing developments overseas, Carter's approval rating was terribly low, and things did not look well for his re-election campaign. And it seemed as if the country was ready for new blood, and of course his opponent that year would be Ronald Reagan. Reagan's 1980 campaign for president brought together the many strands of 1970s conservatism. He pledged to end the stagnant economy by lowering taxes and reducing regulation. He emphasized the nation's moral renewal, saying that it will be morning in America again. Reagan as well appealed to white backlash against the civil rights movement and other parts of the struggle for the expansion of rights. And that is indicated in the place where he made his announcement speech that he will run for president. August 3rd, 1980, he went to Philadelphia, Mississippi to kick off his presidential campaign. But probably a lot of people did not know there was a Philadelphia in Mississippi. You think of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, of course. So why there? Well, the name has some symbolic value, but also, and it's in the South, where the Republican Party is trying to shore up a new base of support in the South as Southerners shift from the Democratic Party to the Republicans. But also, back in 1964, during Freedom Summer, it was in Philadelphia, Mississippi, that 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, disappeared. It turned out that they had been murdered. Reagan's speech there emphasized states' rights, as did the speeches of segregationists during the civil rights movement. Reagan said in Philadelphia, Mississippi, quote, "I believe in states' rights. I believe we have distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended to be given in the Constitution to that federal establishment." During the campaign, Reagan repeatedly condemned what he called welfare cheats or welfare bums, or welfare queens, painting a picture of a welfare recipient, usually an African American woman, sipping champagne, driving a Cadillac. He spoke out against school busing and affirmative action. He spoke of economic freedom. Some of these statements were less subtle than others, but all were meant to appeal to white racial resentment. And so Reagan ran, and look at his slogan, "Make America Great Again." That sounds familiar. So he promised an American renewal, to renew America's greatness after it had been lost by the dramatic social changes of the 60s and a declining economy and the disappointments of Watergate and the resignation of a president. America seemed like it was on the ropes and needed a shot in the arm, needed new optimism. Reagan promised that, pledging to end the stagnant economy, getting the country back on its feet again, renewing its moral purpose. He sought to restore the country's dominant role in the world and restore America's confidence, particularly the confidence of white Americans, because he appealed to that white backlash. And he also called for an escalation of the war of words, at least, against the Soviet Union. Jimmy Carter, turns out, did not stand a chance, and he was defeated handily by Ronald Reagan in a nation that was thirsty for dramatic. As president, Reagan would implement a new economic plan. His plan, his policies, were known as supply-side economics. And what this meant was that he would reduce the tax rate on businesses and on the wealthiest Americans, with the argument that cut taxes at the top and the benefits would spread throughout the economy. These people they are consumers, they are job creators, and wealth will trickle down. He cut the tax rate for the wealthiest Americans during his presidency from 70% down to 28%. Now, what this graph shows, this is the effective tax rate. So this is what people in actuality paid after, rich people can afford good accountants. But you see, in the early 80s, on the left side of the screen, look at that significant dip in the effective tax rate on the top 1%. Dramatic. And it would drop even further in the mid-80s before rising somewhat again, but not getting back to those earlier levels. He cut anti-poverty programs, social welfare programs. He even proposed privatizing national parks, all in his effort to shrink the government. The The impact was initially positive as the economy recovered within a few years. But this recovery was in large part thanks to efforts by the Federal Reserve to the Federal Reserve had raised interest rates dramatically to as high as 20% in order to get a handle on rising inflation. And once the Fed reduced the core interest rate, the economy took off once again. But we see the worsening of a trend that has continued to our present, and that is economic inequality. So as you see, starting in the mid 1940s, and throughout the 50s, throughout the 60s, real median family income, this is the money that the average American took home, it rose and rose significantly. This is, of course, the post-World War II boom, the period of greatest economic growth in American history. But we see that rise in median family income began to slow down in the 70s, drop during the early 80s, during late 70s and early 80s, rise some, drop, and drop again toward the end of the 80s into the early 90s. So we do not see dramatic gains economically for your average family during the 80s like the country had seen particularly during the 60s. And in large part, income growth is being concentrated. Look at the difference between the rising fortunes of the top 1% of earners compared to the bottom 90% of earners. The green line, again, you see it rising pretty significantly in the 50s and 60s, begin to drop in the 70s, and remain stagnant during the 80s. It would rise some during the 90s and then drop in the 2000s, particularly around the time of the Great Recession, 2008-2009. So this is to say that the money that was supposed to trickle down did not. Supply side economics does not spread the wealth. Now there were limits to Reagan's reorienting the government and the economy. For example, Reagan worked with Democrats to raise taxes in order to extend the life of Social Security. And he actually raised taxes a number of times, and you see that on the earlier graph. But we see in each of the last two graphs we've looked at, we've seen toward the end of the decade, end of the 80s, early 90s, we've seen incomes drop and some economic problems come to a head. That was in large part due to the savings and loan crisis. And not to belabor this point or get too deep in the weeds, but savings and loans were financial institutions that had been more heavily regulated than banks, But then under Carter and under Reagan, under Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, regulations of these savings and loan institutions loosened up, and they started abusing their newfound freedom. Fraud was rampant, and once the chickens came home to roost, you see on that chart there the number of bank failings. Look at how it shot up, beginning in the mid-1980s, particularly in the late 80s. Tremendous number of failing banks, which required a bailout, the government rescuing some of these banks. So not only did trickle-down economics fail to trickle down, deregulation also led to responsibility on the part of financial institutions and recessions in the late 80s and early 90s. So there are consequences to shrinking government, whether it's in regulation or cutting back on social programs, anti-poverty programs that people depend on, especially when the wealth is not being shared as promised. But one part of the government that would not shrink, in fact would grow, was the military. Under Reagan, the government ramped up military spending as the president revived the Cold War, which had already been rekindled after the invasion of Afghanistan. But Reagan stepped it up even more. He sent troops, for example, to the Caribbean island of Grenada to oust a pro-Cuban regime there. Cuba, as we saw, went communist in 1959 and still was under Fidel Castro, in fact. As many of Reagan's predecessors had done, he supported, in some cases, brutal dictators simply because they were not communist, like Augusto Pinochet in Chile, Somoza in Nicaragua, and even tolerated apartheid in South Africa because it was determined that a communist alternative was even more dangerous. The biggest foreign affairs controversy of his presidency was the Iran-Contra affair. In 1985, President Reagan approved the sale of weapons to Iran. Remember, we saw that in 1979, Iran underwent a revolution. In 1985, Iran was fighting a war against its neighbor, Iraq. Reagan approved those weapon sales to Iran, even though Iran was technically an enemy of the U.S. The Iranian revolutionaries had held American hostages. Iran would later be deemed a state sponsor of terrorism. Reagan approved the sale of weapons to Iran in exchange for the release of hostages. This is a different set of hostages than the ones taken at the embassy during the revolution. Those had already been freed. Meanwhile, while this deal was going down, members of Reagan's National Security Council were diverting some of the money from Iran to a group of Nicaraguans, a group in Nicaragua called the Contras. The Contras were revolutionaries in Nicaragua fighting against the Nicaraguan government, the elected Nicaraguan government. This government in Nicaragua was deemed too lefty, had the smell of socialism to Reagan, and so his administration was supporting these Contras who were trying to remove, overthrow the government. And one of the problems with this was that Congress had actually passed a law making this illegal, making the funding of the Contras illegal. In fact, the CIA was planting mines in harbors, in the harbors of Nicaragua, which Congress had also outlawed. So there were people in Reagan's administration who were defying congressional law. At the same time that America was selling weapons to Iran, which was designated an enemy. Now, this is a scandal that would not take down President Reagan. His role was unclear. And this cartoon on the screen kind of captures, in a satirical way, his different opinions. First, it didn't happen. It happened, but I didn't know. I might have known, but I don't remember. I just remembered I knew, but the laws don't apply to me. Wait, I just thought of something else. Reagan was often referred to as a Teflon president because things wouldn't stick to him. However, with this Iran-Contra affair, 11 members of his administration eventually were convicted of perjury and destroying documents to try to cover up these crimes, or they pleaded guilty before being tried. Now that was a major scandal during Reagan's years, but he is best known for a policy success, a triumph to many. Reagan is best known for his stance toward the Soviet Union, his more aggressive stance after years of easing of tensions. He ramped up his rhetoric against the Soviet Union. He called it the evil empire. Under his administration, America aided the Afghanis in their fight against the invading Russians. And in 1988, as I alluded to earlier, the Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan in defeat. By 1988, by the time Soviet forces pulled out of Afghanistan, the Soviet Union was on the ropes. Now, despite Reagan's aggressive rhetoric, he negotiated with the Soviet Union's new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who's pictured on your screen. They worked together to reduce arms. And Gorbachev himself would lead reforms within the Soviet Union, reform its economy, opening it up to some free market initiatives, opening up the government, allowing for additional parties besides the Communist Party, and also in civil rights, freeing up the press to an extent. With this new openness, states within the Soviet Union began declaring themselves independent. They saw this as an opportunity and they took it. No longer would they be Soviet satellites or states within the Soviet Union, and they began one by one in a series declaring their independence. Soviet allies and satellites would fall. The communist leaders ousted one after another in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia. The reunification of Germany begins in 1989 and was complete by fall of the previous year. Demonstrators in the streets began tearing down the Berlin Wall, which, as we've seen since 1961, had divided Germany's capital. This was the Iron Curtain made whole. Whereas in the past, people would have been shot for attempting to cross the wall. Now, people were in open rebellion and tearing the wall down. In October 1990, Germany became a whole country again. By December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. It had fallen entirely. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the three largest states in the Soviet Union, voted to dissolve the Union. Gorbachev resigned on Christmas Day 1991, and he was replaced by Boris Yeltsin, who happened to be a drunken moron, but that's besides the point. He became president of Russia. So the Cold War finally came to an end. And by the way, Reagan's second term ended in January 1989. He was succeeded by his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was elected president in 88, and he was actually president while much of this was going on. So the Cold War was over. These decades of struggle, of efforts at containment, of success and failure, the Soviet Union finally falls. But what would replace this bipolar world? The Cold War was over, but the U.S. would face an uncertain playing field. New threats awaited. And as we've seen, just because the Soviet Union fell does not mean necessarily that Russia is not an aggressive force in the world. But that's for a different class. So next time we'll talk about some of these new challenges. The fall of the Soviet Union, a positive development that was a brutal regime, but it would also inject more uncertainty into world affairs. And so we'll see how the US and succeeding administrations dealt with that uncertainty.